Getting it. All right. Hold up. Okay.
Coming in. Yes. What's happening out there, Colored Commentary family? Live here on YouTube. This is recording and going live on YouTube. This is, for those of you who don't know it is Colored Commentary, colorful conversations by colorful people. Marcus Lloyd, and with me, as always, is Mr. Antoine Malone. How you feeling in here today, Antoine?
Yo, what's up? What's up? It's good to be back. Good to be back, man. Wait, I am looking forward to connecting with people and everybody on live and in person. So
in-person stuff.
Yeah. So if you're in the chat, say what's up, say hello. Let us know what you're eating on at this lunchtime. We are not
lunchtime.
We're not eating on anything at all right now, but y'all say what's up, represent in the chat. We want to get that energy from you.
That's right. Get it all in there. We want to know who's in the house. We're going to be ready to talk live. We know that some folks are going to listen to this later, but this is a live show starting out season 4 of Colored Commentary. And so this is exciting. Those of you who are listening who maybe didn't get in on the live, we are going to be talking about a couple of issues, but we're also going to be handling questions and comments that people have through our live version. This is something that we're going to do now for a little while, right, Antoine? I mean, this is part of what we want to do to help people get connected to the work that we're doing and to be able to come alongside and guide them. Is that right?
Yeah, I say so, man. I think we are I got some feedback happening, but we are going to do these lives. We want this season to be all about interaction, right? Interactive with you guys. And so we want to connect with the community a lot more, much more than we've got. We want to grow. We want to grow the community and want to connect with y'all. So we thought we're going to try to do these lives once a month, get connected with y'all. We started this new YouTube channel. If you're new to it, go ahead and like and subscribe to the channel. We're going to redrop a lot of our old episodes. So if you've seen the whole list, you're like, man, that's a lot. We're going to try to drop a little bit at a time on this YouTube channel in between these lives so that, you can get caught up. So I think it's going to be fun.
It's going to be fun. And I like it because, this show is powered by Threaded, which is the organization, the Racial Unity and Reconciliation organization that we work for. And, our desire is we recognize that there are people out there like those of you who are listening, those who continue to listen to Color Commentary, and you're out there you want to make change in the community, right? Like you want to be somebody who brings the community together instead of seeing it torn apart. You want to be peacemakers, right? Not peace breakers or peace fakers, but you're probably sitting out there and you're going, how do I do this? Like, what do I say? Like, what are the things I should be reading? What should I be understanding? What's going on in the conversation that I need to know about? And we recognize that can create this feeling, this sort of distancing, where you feel like you're alone out there without anybody to help and know what to do. And so that's where we as Threaded come alongside you as a guide to say, hey, we've been doing this since really officially since 2014. And we have lots of connections, lots of experts, lots of academic connections and understanding and research that just helps go, hey, here's how we can help you go along this process, right? Here's what we can do to engage that. We can educate you on racial issues and culture. We can train you in different ways of thinking through different trainings that we have. We can put you in groups where you can learn and listen to the stories of other people. We are designing tools constantly to help you into the racial conversation. We're trying to facilitate pathways between people of different cultures and organizations and communities of different cultures, and trying to also connect people to transformational organizations in the community. And we hope that as you listen to us and engage with us as Threaded, that on the other side of this, man, you will feel more confident, you will feel more courageous, you will feel more capable, more culturally intelligent, and be willing to advocate for others with others. So that is why we are here, to come alongside you in the work that you are doing.
Indeed.
So we got a lot of stuff coming, a lot of stuff. It's
let
fun.
me say what's up to the people who are here. So we got what's up, Brian. You say good morning. I mean, I know it's morning. It's 11:30, but I mean, some people get an early lunch going. You know what I'm saying? So, but good morning, Brian, Chuck, Paula. Good to see you again as well. Dave Rankin, what's up, man? Where are you? Are you in Texas? Do you know Dave?
I do know Dave. He was trying
You
to
do know
call me
Dave.
right when we were getting on. Very
How did he?
Dave. Try to
Okay,
call
so he's
while I'm
probably right
getting
here
on.
in town. Okay, Billy Beeman, what's up, man? How you doing?
Billy, big Bill Beeman. I
Jill,
like.
hey, what's up? I see some community conversation from Ohio. What's up, man? Greetings to my fellow Midwesterners. I too am from the Midwest, and so that's what's up. Chuck, what's up, Chuck from Colorado, and Melissa. Hey, howdy. Thanks for joining us. And anyone else, representing the chat, say something in the chat. Let us know you're here. Want to hear from you.
Well,
it's
look,
it's a big conversation today.
It is a big conversation, and I think the people are probably ready for us to get into this conversation. This is literally, I think with all the things that we are hearing and seeing out in the world around critical race theory and the conversation around education, looking at multiple video clips of parents at school board meetings, people yelling and screaming and fighting, and even looking at different legislations that are coming in multiple states and different school districts, banning the use of critical race theory, and just against all the animosity, frustration, and anger that's kind of surrounding the whole issue. And so, if you've been with us for a little while, we've talked about this many times. We've a couple, I guess it's about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, we did a couple of episodes on critical race theory. I'd like to say before anybody was really talking about it. Hopefully that was getting people prepped for it. And then, of course, those of you who were a part of our Threaded conference this year that we did back in March, shout out to everybody who came to the conference. We had a session on critical race theory. It's actually called Uncritical Race Theory. And then, of course, if you've been with us from a color commentary standpoint as well, our final episode of last season, even we brought back Rasul Berry, who was at the conference doing Uncritical Race Theory, and just had a more in-depth and longer conversation about critical race theory. And as much as we don't really we are not critical race theory apologists, and we don't even really see in some ways the need for critical race theory in the work that we're doing. We recognize that particular topic, that concept, and that theory is something that people are talking about. And we are here to talk about different things in, Christianity, culture, and race. And so that's a big thing. So we decided to jump into this season 4, that we would start it off with a conversation on critical race theory and education, right? And so probably, Antoine, right here is as good a place as any to do this kind of explanatory comma here, where we kind of go, what is critical race theory? You can't talk about critical race theory and education if we don't start off with a common understanding of critical race theory. So so let's just kind of go through that quickly and see if we can understand maybe some definitions, and then maybe some tenets, and then we can move on to some other things. You want to start us off maybe with some of the definition aspects, and I've got some as well that we can look to.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of the conversation. Part of the conversation is, what is critical race theory? And that's the thing that everybody keeps sort of arguing about. But critical race theory began and is designed to be an evaluation tool. Is basically a theory that's designed to look at the legislative history of America and determine its effect on the racial relationships inside of our society. So, said differently, critical race theory looks at the law of American law in history and in present day, and is trying to understand in what ways does that law contribute to the racial relationship of society, in good ways and bad ways, however way it is evaluating that. More specifically, looking at laws particularly and saying, hey, do they achieve the racial equity or the racialized, do they produce the racial outcomes that we want, the just and equal outcomes that we want. Now, it's not necessarily about having the same, those laws producing the same end results for everyone. It's about eliminating the roadblocks that block rights and opportunities and other things like that is measuring. So ultimately, critical race theory is a evaluation tool. Focus on the word critical. It's an evaluation tool, critical race theory, to think how is race being affected by the American legislative laws in past and present. So that's the primary definition of what it is set out to do, what it is.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that even continues to help us with this conversation is I think there's an aspect of where we're talking about definitions that you and I are talking about, but there's other people talking about definitions too. And I think one of the things I want to do just to even if I could just even narrow it in a little bit more.
Yeah, go for it.
It's so important for us to go to the source to find it, right? And so many people may not even know the source of critical race theory, at least some of the folks who have been kind of attributed as the founders. And so you've got three particular names that come up quite a bit: Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, and Richard Delgado. And so I pulled some stuff. Kimberly Crenshaw was doing an interview with Molly Kaplan on the At Liberty podcast, and this is what she said about critical race theory as far as a definition. She said it's a method of seeing, recognizing, and understanding how racial inequality has been created and how it's continuously reproduced. As an example, she focused on current patterns of wealth disparity and how African Americans have less than a quarter of the median net worth than white families do. So that's out of the mouth of Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the source creators of critical race theory. I'm going to give you one also from Richard Delgado. Now, he wrote a book with Gene Stefan. I can't ever say how to say it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I can't say it well. But they wrote a book called Critical Race Theory, Volume 1, which obviously is about critical race theory. Now, Richard Delgado was one of the originators, and I guess Gene came along a little bit later. But this is, as you read through the book, there's a point that says, what is critical race theory? And one of the aspects of the paragraph that comes after that, it says critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalization, and neutral principles of constitutional law. So based on what you're talking about, Antoine, you're right. It brings it in. It's this idea of really looking at the laws. And one of the things that it's very distinct that I think gets kind of some misinformation about critical race theory is it's not necessarily looking at individuals. In fact, what it's doing is it's taking the individual out of the equation and saying we're not gonna look and examine people's treatment of others, whatnot. We're going to go actually look at the broader system. And so that's where I think it's important. And I give you those definitions because going to the source is going to be helpful for us going forward. And I think it's just good practice for all of us. If we're going to kind of talk about critical race theory, that we should be able to look at the source of it as opposed to maybe the critiques of it that goes along. Does that make sense, Antoine? Is that?
Yeah, I think yeah, we should let critical race theory define itself instead of let other people come and heap upon it some definitions and expand it. And that's part of, again, that's part of the conversation. We're going to move off of this because we could spend the whole time dealing with this part of the deal. We do have some resources available to you. We have a service, we have a membership community in Threaded called The Collective. And so one of the things we do in The Collective is every month we provide a webinar for the members of that community to learn something new or to engage in what's going on or what have you. And so this month we talked about the ABCs of CRT. It's a 30-minute presentation that gives a summary. And so if that's something that you're interested in, kind of going a little bit deeper into this definition, then we spent about 30 minutes on that webinar doing just that. And so I'll put in the links. We'll put in the description here where you can join the collective. It's a membership service that costs about $10 a month, or you can get the annual deal for $100 a month. But I mean, not $100 a month, $100 a year. That's not a deal. $100 a month. That ain't a deal. It's a deal for us, right? Yeah. No, $100 a year that basically gives you 2 months for free. But I want to promote that collective because in our shows, we're going to be talking about things and we won't be able to go deeply into a lot of definitions that we're going to do. But if you've been a part of that collective, you'll kind of have this stream of thought with us and know exactly, be able to get into a little bit, be able to follow a little bit more for us because we're going to try to trim some of these down. So there you go. The collective. Make sure you go check that out.
Right.
Link in here.
So we talked about kind of what critical race theory is, as far as really going to the source, going to the definitions. Now, again, what you do really well, I think, in the ABCs of CRT is you break down some of the tenets of it. I think, though, although we go into more detail in the Threaded Collective, Antoine, those tenets I think would be helpful, I think, for the conversation, because they will explain, if we understand the sort of foundational tenets, those tenets will explain some of what we're seeing as we're watching school bills be written that are meant to sort of counteract critical race theories. So can you start us off maybe giving us the tenets, and maybe we can kind of bounce back and forth and talk about what those tenets are.
You want me to give all four of them, or you want me to just kind of give one of them and explain it?
Well, just surprise me. Surprise me.
Do whatever you like. Okay, so let's talk about just the first one. So the first one that I have down is the permanence of racism. And this particular tenet, often misunderstood, often stretched to mean much wider than what it really actually is dealing with. Permanence of racism is basically saying that racism is ordinary and common. And here's what the tenet is actually communicating. What it's not communicating is that everything is racist. Of course, everything is not racist. I like to use the same example. Super Bowl, if someone wins the Super Bowl, whoever loses doesn't get to come back and say, hey, CRT says that I lost because of race. Of course not, right? We understand that there's winners and losers, and the outcomes are different. So that is not what the tenet is saying. What it is saying is that racism is not an extreme, it's not the product of some extreme or some extreme action, but it shows up in the ordinary spaces of life. It shows up in the common, everyday, subtle spaces, as well as in the extreme pictures like the KKK and skinheads and that kind of thing. So what it's saying is, don't be surprised when you find racism in your everyday interactions, because it's common and ordinary. It's normal it's a part of the society. It's not saying that everything is racist, but it is saying that racist things are not the extreme exception. It is part of the ordinary and regular. And so a lot of people have missed and stretched this definition to make it mean that critical race theory is saying that all things ever is racism, was curly. That was, of course, that's not what permanence of racism is.
Yeah, and I think, as I'm looking at the chat, I see Brian texting in there, kind of talking about CRT and wokeism. Believes every bad or negative thing that happens to a person of color is a result of systemic oppression. That's actually not what CRT is examining on that. They are examining how systemic oppression has affected people of color over a long period of time, and particularly looking at legislation, particularly civil rights legislation that was supposed to really sort of bring equality. That's where that equality theory is being talked about in the midst of Delgado's definition that we articulated earlier in the presentation. Really looking at, is it producing the equality that it's supposed to be producing? So that's not saying that everything is by systemic oppression. I think that's one of those misinformations that Brian's talking about that kind of gets thrown out there. And there's we'll talk about it in a minute. There is a in some ways a movement to kind of bring some of that information out there. So yeah, and
to be fair, there are some people who will articulate that all their problems are the product of race. It's just that's not what CRT is. CRT isn't articulating that, and so we can deal with those thoughts, but that wouldn't be a critical race theory conversation. That's just somebody that's just dealing with that ideal as a standalone.
Yeah, let's keep moving. What's the
fourth tenet? Social construction, that race is a created social category, and we find that everybody typically agrees with this one. That race is not a natural category, but a social category. At least race, as we have come to talk about it, is in America, is a social category. It's more close to a caste system than it is to the natural, to something of the natural order. And so that's what social construction is. That race is a socially constructed idea that someone came up with the categories of race and put them in, and historically that bears to be true. Tenet number 3 is counter storytelling, and counter storytelling is one of those spaces, again, gets rebranded as something that is postmodern or doesn't believe that objective truth can be found through facts. When in reality, all the counter storytelling is saying, hey, if you want to understand the complete and full picture of racism in America, you should probably talk to those who have experienced racism and hear their stories. And their story should have some weight in what you understand to be true about racism in America. What it doesn't say is that their experiences are more important than facts and figures. And it also doesn't say that facts and figures are more important than their experiences. It's saying that the two need to be brought together and considered when we're trying to understand and measure and evaluate the racial climate that we're in and that we've had in the past. And then the last one is
go quick. I just because it's almost like you have to put the caveat after each one of these. There are absolutely people out there who will value experience over facts and figures, and they will say that. We're not saying that there's not people out there who do that. We're just saying that that's not a tenet that's consistent with critical race theory. So again, there's going to be folks who hear these things and go, well, there's somebody, I know somebody who said this to me. Yeah, well, I'm not saying that somebody didn't say that to you. But what we're saying is if we're really trying to get down to the source of it, like what is CRT and how does that maneuver into education and those things, that's where we're engaging at some of that. So.
And then the last one is interest conversions, and that is the I articulate it as the primary instinct to act only from self-interest. So the idea here is that the socially constructed white category in the legislative space will typically not be willing to fight against racial discrimination or fight for changes in racial outcomes unless there's a mutual benefit for them. And so unless the interests converge. And so the idea here is basically that the instincts are not to be sacrificial, but to be self-serving. And so any good that happens in the space of race where it pertains to law are typically achieved by win-win scenarios instead of sacrificial scenarios where you purely give away something to be corrective for someone else. And so interest convergence is saying, hey, typically this is what we see and our instincts lead this direction. And we should be aware of that when we make laws. So those are the four of the tenets that we have articulated.
Yeah, that's good. And I'm checking out the feed here. I see Brian kind of going, I never heard a CRT advocate say concepts of personal responsibility, i.e. choice, is a result of POC problems. Again, it's one of those things. The question I would always ask is who are the CRT advocates? Like who are those folks? And again, critical race theory is not measuring the individuals. That's not its job. Its job is not to measure the individual's choices and what effect it has on their racial outcomes. That's not to say that it's neutral about that. That's not the conversation it's having. Its conversation is squarely on the legislative effect on the outcomes and whether the legislation is facilitating or inhibiting things that cause racial disparities. So the conversation is not about the individual. CRT doesn't pretend to evaluate the individual. It's being critical about the legal system. So therefore, you wouldn't expect anyone who's talking about critical race theory to talk about the individual at all. They should be talking about laws and what effect the laws have on the social order. So no, you wouldn't see that from someone who's in a CRT conversation. Now, that's not to say that those conversations can't be had outside of a CRT conversation. Mm-hmm. They probably can and should be had, but this particular conversation is about legislation and the law and its effects. Yeah, absolutely. That's the good articulation. And one of the things I like with what you're doing there, Antoine, is you're continuing to bring us back to the history, the intention of CRT. And again, one of the things that will potentially be frustrating about this conversation is that CRT in itself has some very particular parameters around it, but the conversation around race has a lot of different things going on. And there's a way in which, and we'll see this in this next section here, there's a way in which I think the conversation of race has been boiled down to just being, and all put under the umbrella of critical race theory. And that's not accidental. That's actually intentional. But Antoine, probably it might be good to kind of go, okay, so we heard about CRT. We know kind of from definition, we heard from the source of that. We looked at the tenets, right? The source of where those tenets come from. One of the things that I've been interested is I've kind of watched this conversation play out as far as dealing with education. The conversation comes around, should CRT be taught in schools?
Yeah.
Right.
That's the big dog right there. That's what's happening right now.
Yeah. Particularly schools, kindergarten through 12th grade. And so I think what's helpful about what's helpful about what we just did is understanding that CRT itself is a theory that has very sort of measurable understandings. It has particular tenets that are associated with it, the definitions. So to teach the two questions I have when I hear that is going, okay, are we asking the question of, can you teach the theory of CRT, which means, can you teach people that there's a theory out there that measures the law based on its racial outcomes? Can you teach the theory and the tenets and show, hey, here's a theory that has these 4 tenets, right? So that's one question. Is that what people are thinking? Do you think, are they wondering if people can teach?
Can you teach these 4 tenets and this definition?
In this definition, is that what people are dealing with right now?
Yeah, no, I don't think that's all. That's at all what people are asking about. It seems to me in all the conversations that I've seen that they are worried about something different.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to say it. And in fact, as I was kind of been trying to, research and find out, okay, so what is it that people are talking about? I went to, Texas has, probably if you've heard on the news, Texas has been kind of battling through this bill, this HB number 3979. And in the midst of that bill, there have been kind of several iterations of this particular bill, but there's sections that are specific to where the Texas Legislation Board here is really trying to make sure that CRT is not communicated, or at least what they believe CRT to be saying is communicated to the children, right? Communicated in schools. And so they're really putting several things in there. So what I think might be helpful is, again, I think, in fact, whenever we get a break and I can kind of pull up the actual link, I probably have it.
Yeah. We'll get a break here in just a minute.
Yeah. And throw up the link in here. But in fact, let me, if you want to stretch for me just for a second here.
Yeah.
I'll get the link and put it in.
I was thinking that anyway. Yeah. So, well, first of all, for those of you who have just joined in, me and Marcus, we can talk about this stuff all the time. We're looking at the chat. And so you guys jump in and share your questions or thoughts or concerns. And we love to be able to kind of bounce off of those. I see Brian is getting in there and doing his thing, and that's cool. Love to get everybody jump in and do as much as you can there. There's a little bit of delay from us and you, so if we get to it a little bit behind you, then just know that that's not us completely ignoring you. There's a little delay between the chat and you hearing us respond and what have you. So but yes, make sure that you do that. If you're here and you're new to the channel, make sure you like and subscribe. It's brand new. It's our first thing that we've done, and we want to try to get to that first 100 subscribers. And so if you would help us get there, that'd be great. We love to do that, and it just helps us get the channel to more people. YouTube sees it as something that, hey, this is of value to people, and therefore you guys can help us make sure we pass it along to others. No, Brian, you're not talking too much. Keep going. It's no problem. Just wanted to make sure that everybody knew that they could jump in. And so we're at the place where we started talking about what CRT is, and now we're about to move into this next conversation. Why is CRT a big conversation in the education space? Is it something we want to be teaching our children or not? And what is all the dynamics associated with that? So Marcus, take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. So I put in the chat, I put kind of this new, kind of at least the most recent iteration of this bill, this 3979 in there. There's earlier iterations. And so what I want to do is just for a second, I want to throw in if you open up this clip and you're going to read it, and we're going to look at a particular section that I think will help us understand where some of the disparities between what CRT is and what people think it is, maybe, and how it deals with education. There's an earlier iteration of this particular bill that included a large section kind of naming certain aspects of what the Texas board wanted to see in the curriculum. And it's really a fascinating piece. It was a section that kind of really named certain things. Like they wanted to make sure that the curriculum, whenever they're, talking and talking to the students and talking about different things, they wanted to cover, basic documents of history in America. This is really dealing with social studies, history, education in Texas public education. So they wanted to see Declaration of Independence, United States Constitution, Federalist Papers, and so on. They wanted to specific, historical figures to be covered: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. But then they had some ones in here that were kind of surprising to me. They wanted to understand Sally Hemings, right? Sally was Thomas Jefferson's black slave. So they wanted to get some of those writings. Frederick Douglass, they wanted to get some of those writings. They wanted to get here, they wanted to deal with some different acts, the Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793. They wanted different documents from the Chicano movement, from the women's suffrage movement and equal rights, the American labor movement. They wanted to really deal with the history of white supremacy. And it says here, the history of white supremacy, including, but not limited to, the institution of slavery, the eugenics movement, the Ku Klux Klan, and really making sure that they articulated that, as they say, talking about those things in ways in which they are morally wrong, right? So there's a lot of different things. Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream speech, which incidentally the anniversary of is tomorrow, as well as his letter from a Birmingham jail. And those of you who've gone through a threaded curriculum have read Letters to Birmingham Jail. It's fantastic, right? But there's lots of different things, decisions that they wanted to make sure, court decisions, Mendez versus Westminster, and they wanted to cover more individuals from a Latino background, Dr. Hector Garcia, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta. Just making
so
sure
these are all things that the schools wanted to have covered, right? Initially,
right? They were writing up this bill. Again, when you get the bill, it's really long, as you guys open up and seeing it. So there's these different sections, and so there were additions. And in one section in the first iteration had a whole list of just amazing different resources that really would cement into the education to make sure that every school is covering these things. So you couldn't just blow past something you didn't want to blow past if you're a teacher, but it's like, no, this is what we are saying that you need to cover. But I'm just giving you a sample of that just as some fun, because to see that there are some really great things, opportunities for us to really lock into some things as far as specifics on what we can be learning. And a lot of that stuff is history that most of us did not learn, particularly history about marginalized groups. And there was a particular section in the bill that was saying, hey, we want you to make sure that you are giving a good history of marginalized groups and their impact on the country, that kind of thing, right? And we'll come back to that aspect, I think, a little later. But they cut that section out and shortened the bill down to the iteration that I put into the chat. And for us to understand, I think, where the connection to what people think CRT is and how it affects education in school, the best section for us to look at is if you go to section 1, so it's at the very beginning, and then go to paragraph 6. And what I'll do, Antoine, is I want to read off kind of each of the letters, kind of, or the numbered pieces of this particular paragraph, and then we can kind of point to, maybe it'd be helpful for the audience if we point to how maybe this ties to critical race theory in some way, or at least the thought about what critical race theory is. Would that be helpful? Can we do that?
I think so. Now, did you say you put a link in the chat?
I thought I did. Did it not?
I don't see it.
It just says It should say Marcus Lloyd, and it looks like there's a link. It's between a couple of Brian's stuff. Did it not pop up in there?
I don't see it in my list, and I do see David's like, can you send a link to the Texas bill, which is, I think, what you posted, right?
Yeah. I put it in.
Try it a second time.
Yeah. I see.
And
you don't see it.
If not, send it to me through the chat, and I'll try it on my end too.
Yeah.
Through the Zoom chat.
Yeah, let me go ahead and just do that so that we don't have to worry about all that mess here. You got it?
I do. I see it here, and so I am going to copy it.
Sorry about that, Chuck, Dave, Brian. I know you guys want to see
Bam,
that.
there you go. How about that? You guys let us know if
There it
that
is.
thing shows up there.
There it is. It's fantastic. So
It's a
again, as you
PDF.
guys are, as you're opening that up, you want to, it's kind of at the top there, page 3, kind of middle of page 3, at least on that particular document. We're going to look at section 6. There are other things throughout that we can articulate, but when I read this paragraph, I was like, okay, I think this really hits on some of the concerns that people may be having that have been added in. So let me just read it here for those who can, and particularly those who are listening via podcast. I know you want to look it up. You can always go and just look up the Texas Bill HB 3979, and you'll be able to see what we're talking about here.
Right.
So
Once again, it's the bill. This is the actual bill from Texas. So
and a lot of it in this particular paragraph sounds like a lot of things that I'm hearing being put into other bills across the country as well. So we'll deal with Texas because we're here. All right. So it says that no teacher, administrator, or other employee in any state agency, school district, campus, open enrollment, charter school, or school administration shall require or make part of a course the following concepts. Okay, so remember, each one, it says you shall not make this a part of the course. So the first one is you shall not make part of the course that one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. Now that sounds fairly harmless, right? I mean, like,
it sounds good.
It sounds good. I think, in this idea of saying, we don't want to make race or sex, something that determines somebody's inherently their value, right? But I think as we've kind of looked at the ways in which critical race theory has been sort of engaged, one of the arguments, sort of the critiques that people have, is that they would say that critical race theory says it highlights this idea of white supremacy. So it puts that kind of in the center of things, which inherently, obviously, if you say white supremacy, inherently says that one race is superior to another. So to talk about white supremacy in a course or a class would be a violation of this first one, that one race is inherently superior to another race. So it potentially becomes a place in which it says, hey, you are not allowed to mention and talk about the ideas of white supremacy in a classroom at all. Would that be fair enough, Antoine, in the mix of that?
Yep. I think that's there. I just want to make sure everybody, if you're following, he's reading off of page 3. Did you say that earlier?
I did. Yeah. Page 3.6.
Okay. Just want to make sure that I missed it myself earlier. So sorry.
Yeah. And I just read number 1 on that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So I'll go on to number 2. An individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, this is what you can't teach. You can't teach that an individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. What does that sound like to you, Antoine, as we are here talking about that?
Well, if we slowly start taking the gloves off, no, no, we're not gonna take any gloves off. But it sounds like, it sounds like it certainly has the language that a lot of the critical race theory has produced, which is to say that because of our environment, we live in, it's sort of a counter to the racist normal and irrational tenet. The one that says that racism shows up in common spaces all the time, and when you dig into it a little bit deeper, CRT would say that sometimes it shows up without us realizing it because we have been trained in our environment to think and act in certain types of ways. This certainly sounds like a counter to that particular deal.
Yeah, and I would go even deeper, right? Because you're talking about it, you're still grabbing onto it the way critical race theory talks about things, which is very much about systems and legal, whereas this particular thing is dealing with the individual, right? So it's saying that you can't teach that an individual is inherently racist, which I know that as I talk to people who kind of are having conversations about race, or they're having conversations about CRT, one of the things they would say that CRT says, which it doesn't, is that if you are white, you are inherently racist, right? That very, like, whether it's consciously, whether you're you're doing this consciously or it's even unconscious. So like it's inherently what you're doing. And particularly here, they've got both racist and sexist, right? So white male, you're inherently this way. And so this particular section seems to want to protect that kind of thing from being said and being communicated via a classroom, right?
And which again, you said it, but you said it really quickly. That's not what CRT particularly articulates, but it is what people are saying CRT articulates. And correct. Therefore, we're getting this pushback on it.
Right. And I think that's a great way to say this. Again, we keep coming back, and we will keep doing it over the next couple of ones, is that, okay, this is what people are saying about CRT, but this is what CRT is. And so we want to get to where's the discrepancy? Like, where did the discrepancy come from, and what is motivating that, right? So let's keep moving through this a little bit. All right, the number 3 on here says you can't teach that an individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partially because of his or her race or sex.
Again, sounds great.
It does sound great. In the midst of the CRT conversation and even the race conversation, I think what happens is those who not necessarily are proponents of CRT, but those who are having the race conversation, I think sometimes people use this conversation as an opportunity to they weaponize it, and they use it as an opportunity to attack white people. So they would ultimately be able to look and go, hey, we are discriminating and attack and say bad things about white people because they are inherently racist and an oppressive group, right? Which is what the number 2 was trying to guarding against in this section as well. And so the school, at least as it's putting it together, is really putting it in here, I think, to protect that from happening to particularly white people. If they're reading these things and seeing it, there may be some folks who want to weaponize it in turn and go, hey, we want now to say bad things or discriminate against white people because of the history of discrimination that has been kind of put forward historical standpoint.
Yeah.
Again, that would go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, and when I'm reading that, I think about affirmative action. I think about some of the correctives that are anti-discriminatory or correctives that are attempts to be correctives that are race-based. It would say, hey, if you are a Black person or whatever social category, if you're this thing or this category, you're going to get this thing. And this particular thing say, hey, we don't want to teach. Again, it sounds virtuous. It sounds like, hey, we want to treat everybody the same, but it eliminates this what it's actually competing against is the corrective actions against certain aspects of society that would be solely for them. And so it protects, on the surface, it looks good, but underneath it, what it's really doing is protecting really the white male in this deal.
Yeah. And that's not to say that white males are not worthy of protection. That's not what I was saying at all. I think that in the midst of the conversation, particularly in race and particularly in the history of the race conversation, we see these points along history where when there starts to be a change in sort of either laws, social understandings about race, that there's this pushback in the opposite direction many times from the white community. Not all of the white community, but a segment of the white community. We saw it if you go historically, look through Reconstruction, as they were taking away laws that prohibited African Americans from participating in voting, participating and being in a part of government and all those kinds of things. We saw this tenet of reverse racism starting to pop up, which is something we are very familiar with right now. We can also see that at the right after the civil rights movement, after the bills of 1964, 1965 Civil Rights Acts, 1968 Immigration Act, we see moving into the 1970s, there were cases like Bakke versus, I can't remember, it's Northern California, but it was a kind of an anti-affirmative action place where it was saying you're discriminating against white people with some of these affirmative action legislations, which, to your point, Antoine, you were saying those are corrective. So this is a point where it's saying, hey, you can't practice reverse racism. I don't have time to get into the inaccuracies of even the phrase reverse racism right now, but that's kind of where I think this is pushing toward. It's the protection.
Chuck, you make a good observation. One could connect this if what we're saying is true, then it does connect well to the interest convergence. You're right, I think, or at least you can make a strong case for that.
Yeah, and I think there's actually a couple of other sections in this number 6 here that actually almost points directly to interest conversion as well. So we'll keep going here. Number 4, members of one race or sex cannot and should not attempt to treat others without respect to race or sex. Yeah, this one is, to me, and just my opinion, is poorly written.
This is legalese right here. All the doubles and triples and quadruple negatives.
Yeah, it is not helpful. I'll read it again. You are not in your classroom. You cannot treat members. I don't even know how to say this one.
Cannot teach.
You cannot teach that members of one race or sex cannot and should not attempt to treat others without respect to race or sex. Do you know what it's talking about here, Antoine?
I don't know, man. You just sit down and think about it, like roll it over your head like multiple times and try. Here's what I think it's saying after all the doubles and triples. What I think it's saying is that we should try to treat everyone the same, irrespecting their race or color. I think what they're trying to do is to say to judge by my character, not by my color or what have you. The thing that Martin
Are you really dropping that in right now? You were really.
I know. I already know. I know. We gotta like clean it up later. But I'm saying I think that's what this is trying to say in this legalese way. Again, sounds good. It's basically saying, hey, treat everybody irrespective of their color and race. It's kind of the colorblind statement.
Yeah. Yeah, it has that sense of where the idea, again, kind of the way in which people connect this to CRT is because critical race theory is actually acknowledging that there are different races. It is not colorblind. It is now, I don't even know what the opposite of colorblind would be in this.
And I guess color seeing.
Color seeing, like they're color centric. That's probably where they would say is a critique of their personal critique of what they think critical race theory is.
Yeah, they would say where they're getting the critical race theory is a racist idea because it's centered on race.
Because it's centered around race. Now, again, this is not centering around race as a worldview in the lens at which to see everything in the world. Critical race theory is specifically looking at the laws, and particularly the laws that were created to counter the inequality and unequal treatment of people of color in the United States. So they are looking at particularly race-based laws. It should be of note to us to recognize that race is such a palpable thing in our society that we have laws that are associated with race. Like race, and the idea of race exists in our body politic, not just in the 60s, but all throughout. So there is enough that you need a theory that's going to now examine those particularly race-based laws. So again, that's what critical race theory is. What this school piece is talking about is not critical race theory, but what it's doing is trying to make sure that people don't make too much of race, and in some case, don't maybe not make any, but just not talk about, make race a conversation at all. Which again, we have we did a podcast, a very podcast, I think we do on color blindness. So if you want to go back and see some of that stuff, you can go check some of that stuff out. Gosh, I get so caught up in that. That was the one that was the craziest one.
It is the craziest one.
All right. Well, all right. Number 5.
As far as language is concerned.
Number 5, an individual's moral character. All right. You cannot teach that an individual's moral character is necessarily determined by his or her race or sex. You cannot say that an individual's moral character is necessarily determined by his or her race or sex. Thoughts?
Yeah. So this is protective of um, it certainly feels protective of the group that's being that believes that it's being villainized in the American historical narrative as the bad guy and the inescapable bad guy. This is kind of a counter to me. It feels like a counter to the interest convergence, in the sense that for those who have stretched it out, right? They've stretched interest convergence to mean that if that white people are no good and can never be good, and they only do good things when it serves them their own interests, period, outside of law and including the law. That's where people have stretched it. That's where we're getting these religion and worldview and ideology accusations where it pertains to critical race theory. And so this seems like a counter to that. What they're saying is, hey, you're not going to be able to attach morality to skin color. I agree with this thing. I agree with this. I think this is fine. I also think it's an unnecessary statement. I don't think that many people in schools have been or are teaching that because you are one particular skin color, you are inherently morally depraved. I think that's more of a social caught thing than a social taught thing. Certainly not from the schools. We do have some things in history, like you had Malcolm X and that whole the Black Islam movement that cast white people as devils, but that wasn't in the school system. That's something that's on the outside of it. So there's never been. I didn't grow up being taught anything about white or black being something that moral character was attached to. And so I don't think this is this seems like an unnecessary thing to write into the law, but it does feel responsive to the misinformation about what critical race theory is and what it's trying to say about white people.
Yeah, and what's ironic about it is that if you, in some ways, a lot of the history that people don't want ultimately taught in the midst of all of this will show that at some point these things were being said about people of color, that they were inherently immoral, right? And there's lots, there are works of art that we read through in which they say those kinds of things. So there is a protective. I don't want to sound like interest conversion here, but that kind of protective wasn't put in place when they were saying negative things about the morality of people of color. But now that we're at this place where there's this possibility of this inherent immorality of white people, now there are these sort of stoppages and kind of boundaries saying, hey, you can't do that. Now, what's great is if this is really practiced, it will protect everybody. But it seems
that's what I was about to say, because if there's anybody who's received historically the downside of moral character being attached to skin color, you could make the strong case through varying sources of data and statistics and
history, which ultimately should be taught in the midst of the social studies class. Yeah,
right. That black people have been seen as more promiscuous, more criminal, more this, fill in the blank, in so forth and so on. And I don't think it's been, again, I don't know that it's been taught curriculum wise in a school, but the ideas have certainly been there. So you're right. This thing should be protective of everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. It's good. And it's I see in the community conversation there, so why are more kids of color receiving more discipline actions? Yeah. It's one of those things. That would be some way in which a conversation or critical race theory would start to actually examine that a little bit. So the practice of aspects of critical race theory may look at that and try to understand, hey, is there racism involved in the midst of this disciplinary?
And that's the question. Real quick, I want to zone in on what you just said. Critical race theory doesn't come in and say, this is it, let's prove it. They're not saying this is racist and we're going to do what we need to do to make it so. What they're asking is, here's a disparity, a trending disparity, by the way, not something that's one off, but a disparity that shows up multiple ways. It looks like a trend or a pattern. Here's a trending disparity, and we want to know, is the law contributing to that disparity in a racial way? And if it is, let's change that law. And if it is not, then let's go deal with that disparity in some other way or accept the disparity as something that is. But critical race does bring the question, is race, is the law facilitative or a facilitator to this disparity, to this racial disparative outcome?
Yes. I'm going to keep moving because these next ones, I think, really hit at the heart of where some of the fears and the anxiety comes out, not just in conversation on critical race theory, but conversations around race altogether. In fact, I would say it's more predominantly in the race conversation, and this has been sort of put under the umbrella of CRT, and it's not what CRT is saying, right? So number 6 here, you cannot teach that an individual, again, individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. I mean, to me, this is a, if you are in the race conversation at all, you constantly hear a sense of you hear the conversations around reparations, right? Should there be some repair because of something that happened historically? Well, who pays the price for the things that happened historically? If you do reparations, who pays the price? Well, the people who are alive now, not the people who actually did whatever it is. Or you hear that conversation of, I didn't do that. Why am I being punished for it? Why am I kind of getting all these things, right? And so I think that, again, critical race theory doesn't deal with that. It doesn't say, where the punishment, if you will, if there's a deal, it doesn't deal with that. It's asking the question, where did this come from? Like, what happened? Who are the individuals the systems that are at play? And if it's talking about individuals, it's maybe looking at a group of individuals who put the system into play. So all that to say, this is a place where, again, they're not necessarily dealing with the truth of what critical race theory is, but they are addressing some of the concerns that I think people have that around this conversation of race altogether. Anything you want to add to that, Antoine?
No, I think that's the most transparent of the things we've read. There's only one group that's really being asked to deal with the sins of its past on some level from a racial point of view, and that is the white community. So this particular statement feels transparently protective of the white community. And by the way, I think I agree again with the general concept that it shouldn't be taught in schools, but I also am acknowledging that no one is teaching that in schools. Like the conversations where this is being had is not inside of the school curriculums. It's not the teachers teaching it in their classrooms. I don't believe this whole concept of reparation or restitution. That's not something that's being taught. What's being taught is what happened. And then we're all sitting there thinking, well, and there may be some pontification in the classroom, some critical thinking in the classroom to say, okay, we've got the reins now, or you will very soon. What do you want to do about that? And so reparation might be one of the things that comes up in that conversation, and other things might come up in that conversation. But I don't know that it's being taught. So I don't know that this needs to be in legislation. But
yeah. And again, I'm not teaching in the school, so I don't know if they're doing that. But again, this protects against some of those conversations. There are some interesting things here that I think those of us who are Christians would look at and maybe raise an eyebrow to, in the sense of how our own Christian religion actually works out, right? And the fact that in sort of the very center of Christianity is the idea that we bear responsibility for the actions of our ancestors, particularly and we have to make amends for those things. So we would have to think through some of that stuff and what does that actually mean. Moving on to 7. Actually, before I get that, I saw Brian put in here. He said, if Black kids are breaking the rules in school, they are going to receive discipline. Nobody's saying they shouldn't receive discipline. I don't think anybody's saying that when Black kids break a law or break a rule that they shouldn't receive discipline. If we are going to put it in the context of CRT, which is kind of what we're talking about today, CRT would be analyzing who made the rule and how has that rule, has that rule over time played out and benefited. Was it created for a particular group? Was it created and to almost target a particular group? How does that work? And so they would be analyzing that a little bit more. Right. Moving on to section 7, any individual we cannot teach that any individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. You want to start this one off?
Well, yeah. So again, I'm going to say that I would agree that these things should not be taught. That people should feel a certain way, but I also feel like we should teach what history is, because we don't have control over emotions. Some people might read history and feel guilty about it in some way, and others may not. So I think our goal in school is to teach American history. I also think this reveals a hesitancy to guard the comfort, and that's the first word where the discomfort, to guard the comfort of our children, as opposed to allow them to grow and to think critically in the face of adversity. Part of the reason we have what many would call an entitled generation is because we don't have an immune system against discomfort in our children. And part of that is because we're trying to shield them from everything. And so I'm not saying that first, second, third graders need to be taught stuff that's going to make them feel guilty. But I am saying that once you get to the appropriate age level where you can be taught history in the truest forms, and it reveals that certain groups did things to other groups, being able to lead a constructive conversation around that is part of what teaching is all about. And guilt does not need to be the inevitable outcome of teaching true things. Further, I don't think that guilt, even if it does show up, is the final destination of the journey. That there's more as adults who are teaching and parents who are engaging with their children. There are ways to deal with the past and the groups that we've been a part of in the past, and to measure that progress and actually turn that into an inspiration rather than something to feel shame about. And in fact, that's the way most before and after testimonials are told. Things were bad in one way, progress was made, or a change was made, or transformation was had, and now we're here, and now we're going to move forward. So I don't think that this whole concept of guarding the comfort, guilt, anguish, and all this sort of stuff, I think that's again, I don't think it's necessary, and I think we can. I think we do better than that. And I do think, like I said, I think we're protecting. Once again, we're protecting only a certain type of person there.
Yeah, and I'm with you. It shouldn't be a motivator. It shouldn't be what we're trying to do. But sometimes when you go through stuff, when you're reading certain things, particularly about your history, your past, or even your life, that these things they may come up. Again, thinking from a Christian standpoint, if you go to church, there are times that if you're reading the Bible, that it's going to reveal some things. If you look at what we've gone through and all those things, it's going to reveal some of those things. It's going to bring up some guilt and some anguish in the midst of it. But that shouldn't be what we're about. But this is, I want to validate. I think this is where the fear of parents of thinking about their kids, particularly, like they don't want their kids to experience this shame. And we'll talk maybe just briefly towards the end of this. About maybe some of the benefits of what we're talking about here in this section. But I recognize that parents, they don't want this for their kids. They don't want their kids to feel any shame or discomfort. And they're being told that that's what critical race theory does.
Once again, critical race theory isn't concerned with the outcome of critical race theory. Isn't that all of history is even taught? Is critical race theory wants to measure racism as affected by law throughout history to learn how to make better laws today. And so the truth about history does need to be said for the critical race theorist, but that doesn't mean that the goal of critical race theory is to teach all of history, if you understand what I'm saying. So it's helpful for critical race theory, but it's not its goal. So even this, I think what you're about to say is, this isn't even what we're talking about. Is not even, again, critical race theory would bow its head out of this conversation and says, hey, we're not concerned with whether it's being taught or not being taught. We're just concerned with measuring laws and making sure that they're not contributive to racially unjust outcomes.
Yeah, so it's not even dealing with these feelings of all of this stuff.
Right.
Number 8, and this will be the last one we'll do here. Okay, you should not teach that meritocracy or traits such as hard work ethic are racist or sexist, or were created by members of a particular race to oppress members of another race. Again, another very common articulation in the midst of a race conversation. If any of you are in the midst of it and having these, is there seems to be this conversation in the race conversation where when we talk about inequities, the comment is, well, if people work hard, then good things come, and if good things aren't coming, it means that they aren't working hard. And since the people who seem to have the majority of the good things, as far as the asset gap, wealth gap, are white Americans, the idea is that, hey, some idea would say, well, white Americans just work harder than Black and Latinx Americans because they're the ones at the bottom of the wealth gap. And so some people would say, when you talk about inequality, you should blame their position. And I know there's probably people on this chat who would say that you blame their position on just their personal and moral behavior of why they got there, as opposed to and their lack of hard work of getting there, as opposed to also looking at, and this is where I would say, hey, yeah, you're absolutely right. There's people who are in their position where they are because of their lack of hard work, and there's a lot of people who are in their position, in the higher position, that didn't work hard either and got there. But there's also what critical race theory does is looking at the system and said, is there anything in the system of the laws, particularly moving through history and even pulling till now, that actually is also contributing to this big piece, this gap, this wealth and asset gap. And so to go further, what this curriculum doesn't want you to say, or what they want to protect you from saying, is that there's something wrong with hard work, and anybody who is working hard is racist, which I think in the midst of what I just articulated, it's protecting you from saying white people are racist, and that's the only reason that they got to the position that they're in. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's a little bit against the Marxist ideology, the concept that, hey, critical race theory is a Trojan horse for Marxism. Is also a little bit against the white privilege, kind of in a similar way that you're saying, hey, we believe that people arrive to where they are solely on merit. When again, critical race theory isn't even in the conversation of whether meritocracy is a thing or not a thing. Critical race theory just wants to know, hey, there's a wealth gap between races. Is there something in the law that's contributing to that? And if there is something in the law that's contributing to that, let's change that. If there's not, then critical race theory is out, and the conversation can be had not under the umbrella of critical race theory, and we still deal with what those problems are and what have you. So,
well, and hey, just I want to grab on that, just what you're saying, because what you said is really important. Is when you're talking and you're listening and writing, or listening and reading the sources who created critical race theory, the sources, not the critiques, but the sources. You'll hear them, particularly, I think I heard it a lot with Kimberly Crenshaw. You'll hear her talking about looking at, let's say, the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, 1965. These acts were put into place to try to stop the growth of inequality, to not necessarily reverse the positioning of inequality that was going on in our country. As they got to the late 1970s and the 80s, they were starting to see, okay, these inequalities are continuing to exist. Why are these laws that we put in place not working to achieve what they were trying to achieve? Right. And so that's what that conversation is being about. Right. Again, that's what critical race theory was investigating. The conversation, again, around meritocracy, personal behavior, those kinds of things are not necessarily going to be components. They may be components, I guess, of that particular tenet moving forward. But the reason why critical race theory was to kind of go, hey, we created some laws that were supposed to be making this go the opposite way, and it's not. So what's wrong? Is there something in the laws that we need to examine? Right. So that's where you would see a little bit of that help, I think, in the midst of this. This particular law, again, seems to be very protected to make sure that people aren't made fun of, or are
I mean, at the
shamed
end of the
for working
day,
hard.
yeah, at the end of the day, it just wants to make sure that white people and white kids, don't walk away from school feeling like they're the bad guy,
They're the villain.
and that they're the villain, and that's why they want them to feel proud of their heritage, not shameful of their heritage. And that's where patriotism comes in. CRT is anti-patriotism, anti-America. All these different accusations against CRT are really just to say, hey, we don't want to feel shame. We want to feel pride. And it feels like, while this is, well, everything that we just read, these 8 things we just read, they on paper look like, yes, I can agree with all those things. But when you add the context of the conversation that we're in, and you begin to say, okay, so who are these? What is this being written to protect? What we're doing right now is what critical race theory would do. It's sitting here looking at a law and trying to decide whether what is being written, these 8 things that are going on, is this going to contribute to more or less racial division? And by sitting here looking at the law and trying to determine how helpful or unhelpful it's going to be, is the practice of critical race theory. What we're doing right now is what critical race theory would be. All this other conversation about race relationships are race conversations, not critical race theory conversations. You know, if race was Batman, critical race theory might be one of the tools on his tool belt, right? But critical race theory is not Batman, right? You know, it's more like the zip tie or the remote control or whatever he might use. It's just one of the things in his utility belt. And the way it's being talked about is as though critical race theory is Batman, or is, I guess Batman's a hero, so I shouldn't use him. But you get the gist. Like, the person, the thing that they're fighting against, they think that's what it is. In reality, that's not at all what it is. It's just one little bit of piece of what we're doing. I do think that, like Paula is saying, critical thinking skills is important. America has progressed. The resiliency, the ability to learn from failure, which is what resiliency is. The instinct, or the building of a trajectory of hope, and to be able to understand past mistakes and move forward critically. These are things that we want our students, by the time they become contributive adults in our society, we want them to have resilience. We want them to understand and be critical thinkers, and to be able to overcome problems, tough problems, to make a better future, to continue to progress going forward. We can't do that if we're going to hide all of our mistakes and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, so much of the conversation right now, particularly around the race conversation, and again, the CRT gets lumped into this. CRT is a small portion of it, has this sense of anti-Americanism, right? It's like, hey, when you're talking about race, when you want to talk about the history, when you want to analyze the disparities and the laws and things like that, it feels anti-American. And if you read any of, again, Kimberly Crenshaw, again, I'm not an apologist. I'm just somebody who's going to the source to try to go, okay, what are they actually saying? And if you read a lot of her stuff, and I was reading something of a podcast she was doing, just a script of it. She talks a lot about this idea of trying to defeat those who are trying to destroy our democracy. We're talking about Dr. King's dream speech. Is the anniversary of it is tomorrow, right? And one of the things he says is, hey, we're coming here to cash in, on the hope and the dream of this democracy that we have not been able to experience. This idea of people living as equals. We have just never experienced that. We love this democracy. We love this country. We love the ideals. And what we want is to see it's actually lived out completely. And so again, if you're thinking about critical race theory, or at least any kind, don't call it critical race theory, an examination to go, can we examine our laws and make sure that they are actually producing the fruits of this beautiful democracy that we have here? And if they are not, if there seem to be these disparities of one particular group that is experiencing this thing differently than the other, we need to examine, is there a way to counteract that? Because we want everyone to experience the wonderfulness of this democracy, right? And so you would hear that a lot if you're reading through some of the source material of critical race theorists, or at least the original writers. Now, that's not to say that there are not people out there who are maybe trying to destroy this democracy, who would say that this is not a viable way to go about doing life, right? And I say yes or no to that, because I recognize that God has a different economic system, has a different sort of ruling system. And I recognize that there are flaws in communism, there are flaws in Marxism, there are flaws in capitalism, there are flaws in democracies, there are flaws in all kinds of things. It is the only true, if you will, government that we will ever, and pure government that we will ever truly experience, will be that one that we experience in the midst of heaven when God is at the head. And so it's just something for us to continue to remember, is that these big issues. They're not necessarily always anti-American. They may actually be trying to fight for a more true America, or America that fits more truly into its ideals.
Absolutely. I think you and I were both talking about this yesterday, and we're like, man, look, if I love America and I love the idea of America. I don't know how we've arrived to the place where two groups of people who believe in the Constitution are somehow fighting each other about the Constitution. The Constitution establishes is ambitious about establishing a free country, and so and certainly Black people, I can speak for most Black people that I know, they're like, yes, we're down for free country, or let's make a free country. Let's make a free and just country. That's what we want. And if everybody's in agreement with that, what are we really arguing about? Right. Because we all believe in this experiment of America, and trying to make it live up to the ideals, those original ideals, many of those original ideas in the Constitution, certainly not the ones that needed to be amended, but those concepts of what a society should look like. And so, yeah, it's not anti-American at all. I say this often because I'm a person that critiques a lot of things. And I say, listen, I don't critique anything I don't care about. What we're trying to critique is designed to lead to improvement, not destruction. When you see something, if I'm teaching my son how to play basketball better, I can praise him for all the great things he's doing. But if I don't correct him on the things that he's missing, his footwork that's bad, or his technique that needs adjustment, he never changes, he never grows. Critique is designed to improve, to maximize. And so critical race theory, or the concept of looking at laws to determine whether they are contributive to outcomes that we don't want, is a positive, is a good thing. Now, whether how it goes about doing that, maybe we can talk about whether it's right or wrong or good or bad, and we can have a discussion about how effective that evaluation is. And I wish we were having that conversation, because there's a conversation to be had there. But instead, we're talking about things that critical race theory isn't, and we're trying to protect ourselves from feeling in certain types of ways, which is stunting our ability to grow and improve and maximize as a just society. And that's one of the reasons we're in this conversation.
Yeah, and we've been going for a minute here, but I think we would be doing the public a disservice to not kind of be thinking about, and maybe sort of putting out there, okay, so why do we have sort of these discrepancies, right? And so I think maybe just some thoughts from us about just going back and forth a bit about where some of this is, what we think about the possibilities of talking about whether it's critical race theory in schools, or at least not making sure that we don't lose out on some of these historical stories that may pose or put America in a light that's not as wonderful all the time. You were looking at something you were telling me about the other day, of a gentleman that you saw. We got these discrepancies between what CRT is and then what people think it is. Where's some of that coming from? Can you throw out the gentleman that you were talking about the other day? The dude who's been tweeting a little bit. Do you have that in front of you?
Oh yeah, I do. I forgot it. I don't have it. Let me see. Let me pull it up real quick. But we do have there's a gentleman who's kind of a government official, Let me get there real quick.
Well, and I'll put this in the place just to kind of set it up a bit. One of my biggest concerns is I think some of this conversation is being captured as just purely political, right? I think when we look at the conversation around race, it seems as though the left has been driving that particular conversation. You could go historically, you can go, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 1965 were done under Democratic presidencies. You can look at the Democrats as being the first, political party to put a black person, a biracial person in power, another biracial person, president and vice president. And so they seem to own it. And so it seems like because this political left has owned this race conversation, that anytime you talk about race, it feels like it's a political issue and it deserves a counter political response. Which I think is doing no service to the conversation, because the conversation is not owned by a political party. It's a human conversation. It's one that I think the church should be owning, but it's been being made to be political. And so it seems like that the kids once again have been put in the center of a political battle as opposed to more of a human conversation. And there are people I think who are intentionally doing that. Do you have that, Antoine? Or are you still kind of looking for it?
I don't have it, but I think it's better to read the quote than for me to try to
than to use to do it. That's right.
Yeah.
And so while you're still looking for it, again, another thing that I think we need to check out is, because it's kind of maneuvered through the political standpoint, this is not the first time. I said once again that the kids have been put into the midst of that. We saw this in when integration was happening, and the unfortunate approach of integration by utilizing the students as opposed to utilizing the teachers first. Instead of integrating the schools via teachers and starting there, we did it with the children. And if you go back and look at those pictures, you're going to see this screaming faces at school board meetings and outside the schools who are screaming against integration. And what we find here in this moment is we find a lot of commonality between some of the things that we see. We find that the topic is the same. It's around race, right? And particularly race, the conversation of race integrating into the school. The faces of anger tend to be the same, predominantly white. I'm not saying that there aren't people of color in the conversation. There most definitely are. There always have been. The party that's kind of pushing against this is the same. It tends to be the Republicans, right? And I'm not making a statement. I'm just a statement of fact. The rhetoric tends to be the same. It's this rhetoric of anti-patriotism, communism. King, who again we celebrate tomorrow, was considered a communist by many people. Was called that all the time because of his conversation around race, conversation around poverty, conversation around capitalism, conversation around Vietnam. And then the fear is the same. The safety of white children. Integration was fearful because you didn't want white children integrating with black children. So we see that so much of this is the same. And it's just for me, I would challenge anybody to always take a look and see who you're high-fiving in history with what you're dealing with, and see what that looks like. So,
and just for the record, color commentary is neither color commentary threaded. We're not politically affiliated, and we would not say that we promote conservative or liberal values per se.
We've got quite a whole mixed bag.
Right, as a whole, right? So we're going to get some hell from either one of them because we find that the gospel doesn't allow us to fit comfortably in either one of those spaces. And so when Marcus is talking about the history of something and referring to Republicans on this side or Democrats, he's not promoting one or the other. He's just speaking from a place of factual story, this is what was. So don't misunderstand.
They don't get it twisted.
That we're trying to push some sort of political agenda here, because that's absolutely not our intention. Okay, so the guy that I'm talking about, his name is Christopher Rufo. You guys should look him up. RUFO. There's a lot being written about him. But back in March, he tweeted this. This is what Marcus was talking about. He tweeted this. He says, and Christopher Rufo, he says, and I'm reading the tweet. It says, I am quite intentionally redefining what critical race theory means in the public mind, expanding it as a catch-all for the new racial orthodoxy. People won't read Derek Bell, but when their kid is labeled an quote oppressor unquote in first grade, that's now CRT. That was March 25th of this year. And then he comes back in June and he says this. He says, we have successfully frozen their brand, quote, critical race theory, unquote, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all the various cultural insanities under that brand category. So here we got a guy who's out here very intentionally changing the conversation of what critical race theory is, and the results, he's been effective. He not just him, but those like him have been effective. It's not conjecture. He says exactly what he wants to do, does it, and now we're all having to figure out how to undo the lies that he's created. And as believers who contend for those who are marginalized, some of that has to do with protecting them from their physical needs, the lack of meeting those physical needs. And some of that has to do with these spaces, fighting for the truth and for what reality is. It's one of the reasons why we have to stay in this conversation about critical race theory and allow it to be what it is instead of what something else comes and changes it to be.
Yeah. And what I'm concerned about, there's a part of me that doesn't care. I don't care whether CRT is taught in K through 12,
right?
What we have described it as, right? Like that people are taught about Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell and Richard Delgado. They're taught the tenets, they're taught the definitions. Like I don't care. What I'm concerned about is what this guy is talking about is now any conversation that is about race, the bringing up of racial history gets kicked out of schools because it's being lumped in with CRT, which there seems to be a proponent of people, even some of the Christian realm, that are labeling it like the most deadly, thing for the country and Christianity.
Absolutely.
And so I'm concerned.
It's that number one for many Christian evangelicals.
Yeah. And so what I'm concerned is now when a child goes to school and they read Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, what they'll hear in there is they will hear that the biggest proponent against that kept him from doing what he was doing was white moderates. The child will feel some sense of guilt or discomfort having been heard white, understanding themselves to be that, maybe understanding themselves as not a strong right or strong left, but a moderate. And they will walk away and they will go to the parent, and the parent will hear, "What did you hear?" And then they'll go to the school board. The school board will take away people reading letter from jail, which if anybody who's a Christian here, if you read that, it is a missing epistle of the Bible. I don't want to go that far, but it's really great, right? And what a shame that would be for all students to not be able to take part in that great piece of literature that is really being written by a political theologian par excellence that is weaving in, and again, if you go and listen to the I Have a Dream speech, that is weaving in biblical concepts in the midst of the body politic. It's really beautiful. And so for those things to get kicked out is what I'm concerned about. And I'm also concerned about just the benefits of progress, right? Antoine, I know you talk a little bit about this, like to see us as a country not progressing in our conversation of inequality and equality, that is demotivating to a society as a whole. But to be able to recognize progress is inspiring, right? I mean, talk a little bit about that. Like, progress inspires us. So progress is inspiration, and so for us to be able to, like I mentioned this earlier, for us to be able to look back at history, see that we made these mistakes, see that we attempted to correct those mistakes, and then we evaluated that and learned that we didn't get the job fully done. We did progress, but we didn't get the job fully done. So then we did this and we fixed it a little bit more.
and then we give it to a generation, and that generation like, okay, so what was the problem we were working on? Oh, okay, so we had this thing. We're still want to make sure we get that done. That gives people something to, again, it's inspirational. It gives us somewhere to go, somewhere to do, something to do. It's this idea that somebody was saying the other day, the idea that, hey, we fixed that already when we changed the law. Well, that's what critical race theory is measuring. Did we fix it? And if we didn't, if you're happy about the idea of getting it fixed, and then you find out that it wasn't fixed, wouldn't you want to do whatever's necessary to then complete the job? And so all of us should have a common pride in progress in America. And that progress had contribution from Black, white, and otherwise, as we all came together to overcome what was a major issue in our American historical narrative, and are continuing to do so. And so progress is inspirational. And so we can't teach progress if we don't teach failure and mistake. And again, that's a character thing. For someone to stand up and say, you know what, I made a mistake. That's integrity. And so I think we don't need to be afraid of mistakes and failures. I think progress is inspirational, and we can teach history in such a way that our kids come home not ashamed of who they are, but proud of the progress that has been made and inspired to continue that progress forward. It's not hard to do that. It's easy to do that. And we just have to decide that's what we want to do.
And it's inspiring, not just, again, most of these things that we've seen in this bill subtly are trying to protect white students, but there's also talk out there of we're protecting Black students. Like, people are going, we don't want to teach these things because it will bring shame to Black kids, or they will think that they are victims, and those kinds of things. History, and this is something I've even learned for myself, history, when taught correctly, creates a fire in a Black child's life, right? When you see the disparities that you're going right now, but you look in history, and you see, and you're taught figures from history who participated in the growth of this amazing country that we have here, and they are included in that. They're not just included as chattel slavery, right? Or people who are on the other end of a fire hose, but people who have contributed, whether it's through literature or it's art or it's in government. It actually inspires. It creates something in the Black child that says, I can do this. And so what, again, I don't want to do is I don't want to see these great figures, W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and all these kinds of things. I don't want to see them removed because they make white kids feel uncomfortable, because that actually now prohibits the growth and the inspiration of progress that people of color have, not just Black people, but people of color altogether in this country. They see that that there is a progress to be made, and they can see where we were, as in we were chattel slaves, to appreciating the entrance. This is not political. Appreciate the entrance of a half Black person into the White House. There were so many people when that happened that could not find the joy and inspiration that should give us as a country to see that we had gotten to that point where we had at least accomplished that, because they were wrapped up in the political mess of it all. But for us all across the board, I think seeing the history taught correctly, seeing where we are now, which is better, and seeing that there's possibility to go forward, it should be a wonderful thing. And I think going even spiritually, just kind of close us out here, Antoine, just kind of thinking spiritually about this.
Community conversation. So real quick before we close, I'm just going to Chuck's heading out. If you're still here, thanks for the encouragement. Thanks for hanging on. Those of y'all who are still with us, keep us. We got a few more minutes. Janelle's making some really great comments in the comment section as well. Now's a good time to tell us again what CRT is. Indeed, critical race theory is a discipline designed to examine the effects of the law on racial relations in America's past and America's present. It is a critical test, a sort of litmus, sort of tool to discover the effect of the law, American law, on race relations. That's what critical race theory is. And then it seeks to try to understand why bad laws may have been made in the first place, what our defaults are and how we can overcome those defaults to make better laws so that equality is achieved.
Yeah, it's for the Christian, it's accountability.
It is.
It's accountability. We talk about it all the time. It's examining our lives to see where sin exists.
Yeah.
And then when we find sin, when we find imperfection, which we find because we are all sinners, the confession of that leads to redemption, right? It leads to salvation. Confession leads us to that point. And so
it reconciles us in a sense. It reconciles us again in it with God. It cleans the slate again. We confess our sins on a regular basis. Sin creates a little distance between us and God. And we even after we're saved, and we can still repent and get back good again, get right again,
Right.
And confession. I think this conversation, especially given the allergic reaction of the conservative evangelical to the admittance of mistake and so forth and so on, and even the inability to forgive. Mm-hmm. I think the conversation tells us from a biblical point of view, us who are pastors, who are looking at our people, what it should show us is that there is a gaping hole in the confession aspect of the spiritual discipline. It should not be difficult for us to confess because we're confessing every day if we're believers, or we're confessing often. We know that we're failing and we confess, Lord, please forgive me for this and forgive me for that. And we know that we're not quite as good as we should be. And so we recognize that. And that should be a well-worked muscle in the spiritual discipleship life, right? So that when it comes to someone to say, hey, man, we made this mistake in our past, let's acknowledge that and move forward, ask for forgiveness and make the steps possible, then we know that, hey, that's a normal thing that we do. We often have to deal with our stuff, and confession is easy, and we can exemplify that. We're the poster children for that. The fact that confession is one of the things that the Christian evangelical is least known for, and certainly seem to be most adamantly against, should reveal that there's some aspect in our spiritual discipleship journey that is missing. And I think we might need to understand a little bit more about discipline, the discipline of God, and the confession necessary to stay close, or rather to, the confession aspect of our spiritual journeys. I think it should be there, and the forgiving. I think it's hard to forgive because sometimes if you're not confessing, then you're not experiencing that consistent sense of forgiveness, right? That consistent
sense of trust that when you confess that there's going to be forgiveness on the other side.
Yeah. So because every time we confess, the scripture says, every time we confess, he's just to forgive us of our sins. We get to experience that forgiveness, right? And if we get to experience it, then we're like, man, that feels great. I can't wait to forgive other people. And so forgiveness becomes a common practice. Confession and forgiveness, common practice in the spiritual life of a Christian, should be not. Maybe not as much as we think. And I think conversations around this kind of reveal those holes in our spiritual our spiritual armor, spiritual discipleship armor.
Yeah. So if we put it into context, critical race theory creates an opportunity for accountability to be able to recognize that if we are achieving this life we want to achieve, and teaching separate from that conversation, teaching about the history of our country in schools with their kids reminds us that we are a perfect union, or that we are a people who are trying to achieve a perfect union. And to do that, we need to recognize our imperfections. And in doing that, that brings redemption to ourselves, and spiritually speaking, redemption to ourselves. So yeah, hey, there's lots in the midst of what we just talked about for our first episode of season 4, Color Commentary, CRT, and Education. We are so glad that you guys have been here. If you are here still, man, if you haven't pushed the subscribe, we're trying to get to 100 subscribers. Push that in there right now. If you're not a part of our Threaded Collective, we want you to be a part of our Threaded Collective. Antoine, that's wearethreaded.org/collective.
Collective.
That's collective, right? Yeah, come in. There's more. There's deeper conversations. There's faculty that comes in that's going to be giving more webinars to help you be even more educated so that you can continue your journey towards wanting to be confident, wanting to be courageous, wanting to be culturally intelligent advocates and capable communicators of what this conversation is about. We're here to help you. We hope this has been a help. This is Color Commentary. It is colorful conversations by colorful people about Christianity, culture, and race. And we know that there are a lot of different people out there with different lenses that they are seeing the world through. You could call it counter storytelling if you want to. They're seeing the world through those different lenses. And so we say, man, go get with those folks and see the world through their lenses. And as you do that, it will allow you to stay colored. Have a great day, everyone.